Kyle Busch had already accomplished almost everything a NASCAR driver could dream of. 2 Cup Series championships, a championship in the Xfinity Series, more than 200 wins across NASCAR's top 3 national series, and even near the end of his career, he was still winning at a level most drivers could only dream about. But now, we are learning that Kyle Busch had one more racing goal that had almost nothing to do with adding another trophy to his own collection. It was about his son, Brexton, because Kyle wasn't simply thinking about one father-son race. He was thinking about a new chapter of his career, one where he could step away from full-time Cup racing, race against Brexton, and potentially make NASCAR history at the same time. And the more you learn about what Kyle had planned, the more heartbreaking it becomes. So make sure you watch this entire story, because the exact plan Kyle had for racing with Brexton and what he was trying to accomplish before that moment makes his loss feel even more significant. For years, Kyle Busch had been one of the most aggressive and competitive drivers in NASCAR. But away from the Cup Series spotlight, one of the things that clearly mattered most to him was watching Brexton develop as a racer. Brexton had already been racing for years, and Kyle wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was coaching him. And according to Ricky Stenhouse Jr., Kyle talked about Brexton's racing constantly. Stenhouse explained that Kyle had what he called a whole succession plan. And then he said something that really puts this entire story into perspective. Anytime we were talking, it was about Brexton racing. He was definitely more happy talking about Brexton racing than anything else. That is a very different picture of Kyle Busch than the one fans normally saw on Sunday afternoons. The Kyle Busch fans knew was intensely competitive. He wanted to win everything. He could get frustrated when things didn't go his way, and he built his reputation around being one of the most determined drivers of his generation. But when the conversation turned to Brexton, the focus was different. Kyle wasn't just thinking about his own career anymore. He was thinking about what came next, and that is where the Truck Series plan comes in. Kyle had previously explained that he had a vision of eventually racing some Truck Series events with Brexton. In fact, when Kyle was still racing full-time in the Cup Series, he said that Brexton was about 6 years away from being old enough to start racing in that series. Kyle explained that this could potentially become part of his timeline for stepping away from full-time Cup competition. In other words, Kyle wasn't looking at retirement as simply the end of his racing career. He had imagined another phase, a phase where he could race trucks, spend more time around Brexton, and potentially compete against his own son. And that is what makes the story so unusual. Kyle wasn't planning to disappear from racing. He was planning to change what racing meant to him. Instead of spending every week focused on the Cup Series, he could eventually have the opportunity to share a NASCAR National Series garage with Brexton. Father and son, 2 generations of the Busch family, and Kyle wanted to be there for that moment. The plan was not about one specific race that had already been scheduled. There wasn't a particular Truck Series event that Kyle had officially announced he would race with Brexton. The idea was bigger than that. It was a long-term plan built around Brexton reaching the necessary age and Kyle eventually stepping away from full-time Cup racing. That distinction is important because some reports have made the story sound like Kyle already had a specific race locked in. He didn't. What he did have was a vision, and that vision was incredibly ambitious. Kyle wanted to race alongside Brexton in the Truck Series while also chasing something that had never been accomplished before. Kyle had already won 2 NASCAR Cup Series championships. He also won the 2009 championship in what was then known as the Nationwide Series, now the Xfinity Series. But there was one championship missing from that collection: the Craftsman Truck Series championship. Kyle had been incredibly successful in trucks despite never running a full Truck Series season. By the time of his death, he had accumulated a record 69 Truck Series victories in 184 starts. That is an extraordinary number. So imagine what Kyle could have attempted once he was no longer committed to a full-time Cup schedule. He could have competed for a Truck Series championship, and if he had actually won it, Kyle Busch would have become the first driver in NASCAR history to win championships in all 3 of NASCAR's top national series. That would have been historic. But there was another part of the plan that mattered even more. Brexton would have been there. Kyle could have been racing for his own championship while also watching his son begin his journey through NASCAR. And depending on how their careers developed, there was even the possibility of Kyle and Brexton competing against each other. That would have placed the Busch family alongside some of NASCAR's most famous father-son racing stories. Lee Petty raced against his son Richard Petty. Dale Earnhardt Sr. eventually raced against Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Kyle had apparently envisioned creating his own chapter in that history with Brexton. Except Kyle never got the chance. Kyle Busch died on May 21, 2026 at the age of 41 after severe pneumonia developed into sepsis. Just 6 days earlier, he had won a NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series race at Dover. That victory became his final NASCAR win, and there is something almost impossible to ignore about the timing. Kyle was still winning truck races right before his death. The exact series where he hoped to eventually race with Brexton was still a major part of his racing life. But the future he had imagined never arrived. And now Brexton has to continue without the person who had been guiding him through the early stages of his racing career. Richard Childress Racing has already taken an important step toward preserving that connection. After Kyle's death, RCR announced that it would suspend the use of the number 8 in the Cup Series and reserve the number for Brexton if he eventually reaches NASCAR. Richard Childress explained that Kyle had helped design the stylized number 8 and that the number would be there if Brexton ever decided to use it. Childress said they were saving it for him. He also made it clear that Brexton should not be pressured into carrying his father's legacy. Childress said, "That kid can drive a race car." He believes Brexton has a bright future, but the decision about how far he takes that career ultimately has to belong to Brexton. And that may be the most important part of this entire story. Kyle's dream was never simply about putting his son into a famous number or forcing him to become the next Kyle Busch. It was about being there. Kyle wanted to watch Brexton race, and he wanted to experience that part of the sport together. Now, when Brexton eventually reaches NASCAR, the number 8 could still be waiting for him. The Busch name could still be on a NASCAR entry. The family legacy could continue. But the person who wanted to experience that moment most will not be standing beside him. That is what makes Kyle Busch's plan so heartbreaking. Kyle had spent decades proving what he could do behind the wheel. But near the end, one of the things he seemed most excited about wasn't another Cup trophy. It was watching Brexton become a racer. And maybe that is the part of Kyle Busch's legacy that deserves to be remembered just as much as the wins. Because the statistics will always tell us how great Kyle was as a driver. But the story of Kyle and Brexton tells us something the statistics never could. Kyle Busch wasn't only planning for his own future, he was planning for his son's. And while he never got to race alongside Brexton in NASCAR, the path he helped create for his son is still there. Now the question is what Brexton will do with it. Will he eventually bring the Busch name into NASCAR's National Series? Will he one day climb into the number 8? And when that moment finally comes, how much of Kyle's influence will we see in the driver behind the wheel? That chapter is still unwritten. But one thing is certain, Kyle Busch had already planned to be there when it began. He just never got the chance to see it happen. This is NASCAR Nation News. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe and stay with us for more NASCAR news, stories, and updates. And let me know in the comments, do you think Brexton will eventually carry the Busch name into NASCAR?